Welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight. I'm Nathan Johnson, the Provost of Davenant Hall. And today will be joining me Charles Carman, who is a lecturer in languages at Davenant Hall. Charles Carman, welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with Davenant.
Yeah, so trying to remember how long exactly ago. Feels like 4 or 5 years ago. Years and years and years ago, I was a student at Davenant. I took not one of the full programs, but I took a few courses on early modern Latin with Davenant. Really enjoyed the lectures, especially with Michael Lynch, Dr. Lynch. They were eye-opening in all sorts of ways. That was around the time that I was also an MA student at New St. Andrews, working on languages primarily, but also theology. And so I'd heard about Davenant from, word of mouth, took some of their classes. And a few years later, after my MA at New St. Andrews, I was asked to help do some of the language program and the language courses there. So for a few years, I was helping, I was running the Latin classes. Then long story, very short, I started a PhD at Catholic University, and that took a little bit of time to work on that at the beginning, especially. So I had to sort of bow out, is one way to put it. And been in the ambit, been in the circles still since. And now that I have the coursework done and the comprehensive exams done, I have a little bit more time and also have the chance to sort of share the stuff I've been reading and researching from CUA in the courses at Davenant.
Well, how did you get interested in ancient languages so that you kind of devoted your whole life to studying them and teaching them?
Yeah, so where to start? Once upon a time, I was teaching at the Great Hearts charter school system in Phoenix. And I wanted to stay sort of sharp and fresh in the mind. And so I thought, well, I'll pick up a language. And a dear friend now, but then just a coworker invited me to a lunch with a bunch of the Latin instructors who also taught at Great Hearts. And I was like, all right, cool. I'll go to a lunch with the Latin guys. I don't know what we're going to do. And we have this lunch and all of them are speaking in Latin about anything you please. And this was very eye-opening to me. This was extremely exciting. I thought I was pretty good at Latin, and then all of a sudden everyone around me is just talking in it about, their food, the movie they watched over the weekend, their students, and of course Cicero and Seneca would always come up. So it's like, well, whatever this is, I love it, and this is how I want to learn languages. So I sort of started out with Latin, went to a few of the conventicula in Kentucky, where Terence Thunberg and Minkova, for many years, they still do it online. That was sort of the stateside mecca, if you will, of Latin, of spoken Latin. So if you wanted to do spoken Latin, that's where you would go. There are other places as well, but that was sort of the mountaintop of spoken Latin. Made a lot of really good friends there, learned a great deal. I went to New St. Andrews for an MA, and they are, at that point, they may have been the one college / university that did this. There are a few more that are popping up, have popped up since, where they would teach a lot of the ancient languages in a sort of spoken active style. So I took actually one of the undergrad programs or courses, because it wasn't technically offered to the grad students, but I wrote a paper and stuff and made it grad proof. But it was reading through Virgil, and the whole class was in Latin. Took a class on Apuleius's rendition of the Cupid and Psyche myth in Latin, and that one, any of the undergrads at NSA will tell you that that's your trial by fire. If you can go through Apuleius in Latin, you can read pretty much anything. It's so true. At the same time, I had worked on Greek. I had gone to the Polis Institute summer intensive course in Jerusalem for spoken Greek. So I was working on reading and speaking Greek. Had a dear friend at the time at New St. Andrews, Dr. Tipton. He and I would meet for coffee and speak Greek with each other. He is a true master of these languages. And I wanted to sort of branch out, so I took the Hebrew course with Dr. Edwards, and really loved Hebrew. It was the first Semitic language for me. It was very much unlike Latin and Greek, obviously at a pronunciation level, at a vocab level. You can't rely on cognates anymore. You're not going to hear a word and it's going to be like, oh, that sounds like there's nothing like that. Learning Hebrew taught me to let the language be whatever it wants to be. All of my predispositions and assumptions about what a language is supposed to do had to break down. And there was one meeting. I was also taking a few courses with Dr. Edwards, just some biblical courses, theology courses, one on the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac narrative. I think it was for that course. He and I were meeting in his office, talking about this and that related to Abraham, Isaac, and at one point he mentioned offhandedly, well, of course, there's the Peshitta, the Syriac version of the Bible. And I just paused and said, sorry, what did you just say? And he pulled down off of his shelf this Bible, and the script was unlike anything I had seen before. It's very lovely. It's sort of the way I sometimes describe Syriac script is it's Arabic, but with a Sharpie. It's a very thick, very simple, elegant script. And I was at a sort of impressionable, it was an impressionable moment in my scholarly career. This isn't true everywhere, but at New St. Andrews, it was sort of blasé to do research in Latin or in Greek. And increasingly in Hebrew, that was just, that was du jour, that's what everyone did. But no one was working on Syriac. And so I want to look more into this. And so I started, took a course with George Kiraz at the Beit Mardutho institution in New Jersey. Sort of bolstered the basics in Syriac grammar, and then went again to Jerusalem also at the Polis Institute to take their immersive Syriac program. And it was really there under our instructor Charbel Risk, and who I just sort of fell in love with the sound, the music of the language, and the more I got into Syriac, the more I realized that if you thought that spoken Latin was weird, or if you thought that spoken ancient Greek was weird, Syriac was this even stranger animal where it has maintained certainly unlike ancient Greek, but to a greater degree than Latin for sort of ecclesial reasons. It has maintained a community of speakers up to today. Everyone, maybe this always needs to be said that there is an unbroken chain of Latin speakers. The Vatican still has an office of Latinists. Every papal bull, any sort of official document has to be legally translated into Latin. So there are guys there who do that all the time. But, maybe related to Vatican II, maybe related to the microphone. This is Marshall McLuhan's argument. Latin in the church traditions sort of petered out a bit. But that's not the case with Syriac. There's a very vibrant community of people who speak Syriac. The same, broadly speaking, the same grammar, the same vocab as Saint Ephrem or Isaac of Nineveh would be speaking. And that alone also fascinated me and awakened me to the sort of the possibilities and the contributions that Syriac especially has for sort of the active spoken pedagogy that's running around nowadays. You don't have to sort of make yourself fluent in Syriac by some sort of autodidact magic or watching a lot of YouTube. There are not millions, but there are thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of people, mostly in the Middle East, some in California, some in Jersey, who for whom Syriac is their father tongue, if not their mother tongue. George Kiraz, for example, speaks Katabanoyo, classical Syriac, with his children. So when I was visiting him recently, we were making pizza in Syriac, debating on what the best trilingual route would work to make a word for pizza and so forth. So that's a little bit. That's maybe a middling length story as to my sort of journey into languages. At Catholic, I've also taken up Arabic, after which I think among a number of modern languages, and I think after Arabic, I'm sort of full up. I think we'll call it a day. Me and my friends, we want to learn Russian, but there's not a whole lot of Syriac scholarship in Russian. There's one dude who writes Syriac scholarship in Russian, but he also writes in English. So, alas. So that's a little bit about that.
So you're going to cap it at 5 ancient languages for now.
For now, when I finish my comprehensive exams, I'm the crazy guy who, a day after finishing the comprehensive exams at CUA, I was pulling up PDFs of grammars for Ethiopic and Coptic, just sort of perusing them. But as far as like reading and sort of active use, I have to cap it somewhere.
Right. Yep. There's always got to be that limit. So, a lot of kind of contemporary colleges, grad schools, they don't really emphasize facility in the ancient languages anymore. And even if you're at a program that's reading old sources, a lot of times they'll just assign them in translation. And so we're kind of raising up a generation, or I guess it's been several generations now, that maybe never took an ancient language in high school and then weren't required to read anything in the original language in even in grad school. So that seems to me to kind of be implicitly arguing that we don't really need, the common reader doesn't really need to have facility in these languages. It's good enough to read things in translation. And if there are some works that haven't been translated yet, they're probably not that important because nobody's bothered to translate them. Right. So how would you kind of convince your students about the importance of actually learning these languages?
That's a great question. The statistic I always bring it up in these sorts of conversations. Well, one statistic. So think of the classical titles or classical works that we have, not manuscripts, but sort of the letters of Seneca, the orations of Cicero. For every one ancient title we have at least 10 medieval titles. So there's a tenfold increase from the ancients to the medieval. And if of course, there's always some sort of debate about, well, medieval Latin, was it that good? Actually, a lot of it was actually extremely elegant and lovely. It wasn't always sort of a butchered Latin by any stretch. For every medieval title we have at the lowest estimation at least 10 titles in the early modern period, and that's probably a low metric. We keep finding more authors that no one knew about. It's most clear when you look at the early modern period. Sort of, if you want to date it between sort of Lorenzo Valla to Descartes or something, I don't know. Everything philosophical, theological, histories, plays, poetry, epic poetry is a big deal. There are hundreds of epic poems just in the epic style. And most of those works are untranslated. Most of them are unknown to us. This is where the research that Michael Lynch does just really shines. Is his familiarity with the authors and the works from that period is much closer to how it would have been at that time than for most theologians who are working on like Reformed theology. They might have, if you're looking at Luther and Calvin, Erasmus, those are obviously some of the titans of the period, but they represent a very small fraction of the literature we have from that time being written. And the work that David, I always pronounce his last name badly, David Sistema, he's a professor at one of the universities in Japan, I think the University of Japan, in Tokyo maybe. They're doing a lot of really good work to show that there is just more material than your philosophy has ever imagined, has ever dreamt from that time. And so a lot of the assumptions, a lot of the history building and history writing around that period is writing about a very, very, very small fraction of what either was already translated or what was most obviously well known. But the equivalent of the New York Times bestseller of that period of a particular decade or a particular century is probably not really well known. I mean, the 17th century New York Times bestseller in Latin poetry, for example, went through dozens of prints. Was the Hymnus Tabaki, written by a medical doctor who was also classically trained, had some time on his hands, and decided to write in two books this sort of floral description of the uses and abuses of tobacco. And no one knows about it. To my knowledge, it's not been translated. It's hardly been researched, but it was what everyone was reading. If you were a Latin student, you would have been laughing about how in the first book, the argument goes, tobacco is so important that you basically needed to do proper theology. Like it opens up sort of it opened the divine gates for your mind. And then of course in the second book, he describes in very explicit detail some of the bad outcomes of smoking your pipe all that often. There's the epic poem that I always talk about. I always, in any Latin course, I always make an excuse to mention it. The Paquiaquidos, written by Bartholomew Pereira, talking at the centenary anniversary of the Jesuit missions. It's an epic. It's written in the universe of Aeneas, and it describes the Jesuit missions to Japan. So it takes place about a decade or so before the events in Chushako Endo's Silence. And it's a work of genius. It's incredibly brilliant. And there is no translation of it. There is some work done in some Portuguese scholarship on it, but there's no translation for it. So this is one way of answering, which is to say, if you rely on translations to do any of the scholarship, increasingly you have to admit the blind spots, the enormous blind spots of your scholarship. If you're relying on a translation, you're not gonna move things forward very much. Pretty much everything's been said about Virgil, and you can write about Cicero if you'd like, but it's pretty much been said. But there are hundreds of titles and boatloads of authors from the early modern period alone, which deserve a great deal of attention, and the only way to access their works is to read it in the original. And that could mean Latin. For a lot of the works, it could mean ancient, even Homeric Greek. There's a Homeric poem written in Homeric Greek on the life of Martin Luther. And, be nice to have that around. It's a bit more obvious in the work that I do. This is one reason why Syriac studies and Arabic studies right now is so exciting, is it's taken for granted that a lot of the works are untranslated. No, there are no delusions like there is in Latin and Greek scholarship. Latin and Greek scholars can delude themselves into thinking translations suffice, but there's no pretension that you can rely on translations. Most of it is untranslated. So it's a bit more obvious that a very intimate facility with the language is required if you want to read not just like one text, but if you want to read the work of a particular author, you need to be able to read that language very easily.
Well, that's good to know, just for even for people who don't have the opportunity to study the original languages, for them to know how much is out there that hasn't been translated, and how much exciting stuff is still yet to be really plumbed and discovered.
That's right. Yeah. There's so much. There is so much out there. Really hasn't been, the barrel has not been emptied by any stretch.
Well, and it seems like that's like you're saying, that's the real avenue for scholarship these days. So if someone's looking to get into kind of higher scholarship, they should look at the languages and then look at all these untranslated works.
That's right. Yep. That's the way to go. That's exactly right.
We probably don't need another dissertation on Homer.
Probably not. I mean, yeah. Feel free to. I mean, don't read Homer. Read Homer, but you should read about the Byzantine commentaries on Homer as well. That's your dissertation. Is the Byzantine authors who extend Homer, write their own poems in the Homeric style, or write their own commentaries on Homer. That's where the good stuff is.
Well, tell us what you'll be teaching in the next 12 months for Davenant.
Yeah, so in the Trinity term, I'll be teaching a course, an introduction to Syriac and Arabic theology. There's the possibility of teaching a Latin class, but that's still in the works, still under discussion. There's one way to, in my circles, one of the dangers of being a scholar who works in Syriac stuff is you forget sometimes how unknown Syriac, and for that matter, Arabic theology is for the larger public. And there is an understandable, a forgivable assumption that the sort of forgetfulness or unpopularity, so to speak, of Syriac can be accounted for a lack of works written in the language. It's a very small set of, it's a very small corpus, or it's a very niche area of Christianity. However, the history of the church traditions speaks against this quite clearly. I mean, since St. Ephrem, since the 3rd century, even before the 3rd century, if we want to talk about biblical translations into Syriac, the Syriac-speaking world, so sort of broadly speaking, east of Jerusalem into sort of Western Turkey nowadays, or Iraq and Iran, there was a very early introduction of Syriac into the Christian world. Eusebius, in his ecclesiastical histories, mentions a letter written to King Abgar by Jesus. Abgar was asking if Jesus would like to send some would like to come over himself, or to speak to his people. And as the story goes, Jesus says, "No, I'm a little busy right now, but I'll send some of the apostles when I get to it." So a lot of the Syriac Christians will tie their history back to St. Thomas, St. Thaddeus, or Adai. And, you know, biblical Hebrew is obviously a tremendous gift to learn, to study. It's incredibly important to look at the Hebrew text. One of the shortfalls or problems that students can run up into is the Old Testament is very large, but it's relatively speaking, it's a very small corpus. If you learn biblical Hebrew, you've got one book, and not even the entirety of that book, which you can read. Portions that are written in Aramaic and such. Syriac can be considered really on par with Latin literature and Greek literature as far as density of topics and genres, as far as the number of titles, the brilliance of the authors and their theological and philosophical acuity, their poetic. If people know anything about Syriac, it's often that they will write their theology in the form of a poetic style, and there are lots of questions and hypotheses as to why this is true. But there's an enormous corpus to be read in Syriac, and increasingly we're also, I'm discovering, this has already sort of been discovered, but there is an enormous corpus of theology, metaphysics, Trinitarian theology, Christology, really anything you'd want from the early centuries. Whether you're an iconophile or an iconoclast, like it's also been written in Arabic, and that one thing that reading Syriac does to your sort of your history space, your head space, where Christianity sort of exists, is it broadens it to what it would have been in the first millennium, let's say. Certainly Syriac goes beyond that, in Arabic as well. But in the first millennium, there, speaking of blind spots again, there is this massive blind spot if you imagine that the Christian traditions are in dialogue primarily through Latin and Greek and not through Syriac. It's just sort of false. And so if you want a good picture of what the early church looked like, you will not get that if you're not reading in the Syriac sources as well. And so the course is sort of designed as a very, a 30,000-foot view. We'll read a lot of texts, some secondary literature, but the primary thing is sort of looking at the texts themselves and giving a little, little vignettes of the authors and the sort of theological situation for the texts, and noticing that there are more conversations involving theology, ecclesiology, martyrology, and any genre of Christian text you can imagine. There's the equivalent in Syriac and then later in Arabic. And if you want a well-rounded appreciation of the Christian traditions, you got to have that. Otherwise, you'll be sorely incapable of unable to appreciate some of the crises and some of the debates going on. I should say for my friends who do research on like Ethiopic and Coptic, I always feel like they're raising their hands in the background saying, yeah, but okay, if you're going to read Syriac, then you better be looking at the Coptic sources and the Ethiopic sources. And what about later when we have, Syriac churches in India? Do we need to learn sort of a version of Sanskrit as well? Yes and no. We will. I do want to read a little bit of some Ethiopic sources with the students. The tragedy of history made it that Ethiopic manuscripts did not survive very much. The humidity of the climate made it so that there actually is a very small corpus for Ethiopic studies, alas. And while there is a great deal early in Coptic, it's also a very small corpus. There's in the Semitic Library at Seaway, you can see effectively the whole Coptic corpus on one shelf, which is really fun to look through. But it's like just right there. It's not stretching across the whole room like it would for Syriac or Arabic. There's a whole room dedicated to Arabic. There's a whole room dedicated to Syriac. But yes, you should, this is what we talked about with this, drawing lines linguistically at some point. There's not as much, and it's not in my, it's not my bailiwick to look into the Coptic sources, but those are also in need of ressourcement, as many people say today, and investigation. So, but if you want to go for the stuff that has just tons of stuff to read, it's the Syriac and Arabic traditions of the early church.
Well, I'm sold. So
it'd be a good time. It'd be a good time. I also mentioned, I think, I hope I mentioned I'll check it later. Speaking of translations, it will be an opportunity as just an additional pitch for the class. It will be an opportunity to read some texts that, at least in English, you will not find, or it will be really, really hard to find anywhere else in the world. There's some stuff that's written in German or in French. So if you can read in those languages, that's great. But if you want to read a lot of this stuff in English, in my courses, we read it in Syriac, and then we're translating it, we're talking about it, but we're not translating sort of for students later to read in English, right? But this is the only course where a lot of these texts, I'm thinking of like Timothy I, the great patriarch Catholicos of the Church of the East. You're not going to find his stuff in English anywhere. We'll get to read his work. Or Narsai, there are two of his homilies translated into English, two or so. Some of the poems or commentaries of Ephraim haven't been translated or are very challenging to find. So and the story is even more true for Arabic. So it'll be one of the exciting things about the class is this is the place where you'd go if you don't have the languages yet, but you want to get a little peep into the room. This is one of the few places where you'll get to do that. So that's something exciting for me and should be exciting for the students. This is sort of a Davenant exclusive, if you like, for some of these texts.
Well, this is a class people don't want to miss. That's Introduction to Syriac and Arabic Theology in the spring. So be on the lookout for that. Well, are there any recent or upcoming publications that we should be aware of or on the lookout for?
There are a few things in the works. The papers I submitted or delivered this past summer, I don't think will be published. I had to check with the conferences to see how that goes. Yeah, before the Trinity term, probably not. I'm actually meeting with my advisor tomorrow to have sort of the final discussion about my dissertation proposal, which means, starting Thursday, I'm starting to write the dissertation. And, if I can, I'll always keep an eye out. I always keep an eye out for a sort of article to make out of those chapters, but I'll be, for the next 9 months or so, sort of buried into the dissertation. I'll see if I can push out a few things here and there, maybe on Ad Fontes or something related to Syriac theology. Yeah, no, I'm scheming, but nothing definite just yet. There is, I should say, there is one project I'm working on for trying to write and develop some easy Syriac readers for students. So if anyone out there is interested in learning the language Syriac, that's something that I am working on. We'll be posting here and there about. But yeah, scholarly stuff. It's sort of it's all in the closet in the office, with candlelight right now. But nothing out into the world just yet. But we'll see.
Got to get that dissertation done.
Yeah, the best dissertation is a finished dissertation.
That's what they say.
They say. It's so true.
Well, as we kind of close out our time here, I wondered if you could give a quick pitch for why people should consider taking courses at Davenant Hall or even enrolling in the degree program.
Well, I think I was talking with actually got to meet for the first time in person Joe Minnick a few days ago at a wedding, and it was so refreshing and encouraging to see more and more of the Davenant folk in person. He and I were talking about what Davenant is doing. This might sound like what everyone else would say, but it's just the gospel truth in a way. What Davenant is doing is very rare. Like you were saying, they're in the higher echelons of academia right now, work in these languages, work in these periods, the early modern period or early Christianity. It's really burdened by, let's just say, frameworks and philosophies that are not extremely persuasive. There's sort of the political aspect to all of this stuff that is very tedious. There's the materialism that sort of creeps in and sort of the historical critical method, which is extremely hot right now, especially in the stuff that I do. If you want to do, Syriac research, it's very vogue to analyze an author, not for what they believe, not for a contribution to a theological conversation, but sort of peering into sort of the textual level and saying, haha, this homily is not real, or haha, this homily is just propaganda. It's not actually a genuine take on the author's beliefs on anything. A lot of that is very tiresome and very discouraging from a scholar standpoint. If you're someone who thinks, for the sake of argument, let's assume that these guys actually believe what they're writing. Let's assume that they're extremely intelligent, that they memorized more scripture than we normally do nowadays, that they took the church traditions and the Bible seriously as something to be respected, as something to be defended. Then you need to go to Davenant. Those sorts of views are taken for granted by the instructors. The students are, you don't have to wade through a lot of methodology and all of that silliness. You're looking at the texts and trying to figure out what are these texts telling us, and what are they teaching us. Increasingly, that is a rare and therefore extremely valuable thing to find. I think in the age of sort of internet education is a very complicated and there's a lot to be dealt with there. But one of the things that I think Davenant has done a really good job in is sort of focusing on the things that are rare and not simply publishing the same old that anyone else does, but just on the internet. The publications that come out, the instructors, they're always offering a new technical, very well-read approach to all of these periods. And that's woefully underappreciated by a lot of the higher towers in academia right now. But it's not at the expense of academic rigor or at the expense of, certainly not at the expense of linguistic rigor. The work that I always just praise them up and down, the work that Michael Lynch does, and just the assessment of the Latin text that no one else is reading. Ryan Hurd also does this. Just reading through all of the commentaries on Salamanca school and reading further into the later Thomistic tradition. That's the good stuff. And there are fewer and fewer places where this is appreciated, and among those, even fewer where it is done with excellence. And so that's one pitch for it. This is just where you go to get the rare goods, the bespoke goods, if that's how the kids use it these days.
Yes, if you want to get the bespoke goods in theology, come to Davenant Hall. If you want to learn more about Davenant Hall, you can visit our website at davenanthall.com. And I encourage you to particularly check out in the spring Charles Carman's course on Introduction to Syriac and Arabic Theology. That's going to be one you don't want to miss. Well, Charles Carman, thank you so much for joining Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you for the conversation. It was, it's always encouraging and wonderful to review and consider these things with others who care and want them to be more widely known.